The first-class cabin of Flight 217 was a quiet sanctuary of luxury. Soft leather seats, ambient lighting, and the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee created an atmosphere of calm sophistication. Passengers reclined in their spacious seats, some sipping champagne, others scrolling through their tablets. The gentle hum of the aircraft provided a soothing background noise. Then, a sharp voice sliced through the tranquility. "Hey, what are you doing here?" Heads turned. The sudden disruption was unexpected in a space where passengers prided themselves on decorum. A tall, middle-aged man in an expensive navy blue suit stood in the aisle, his face twisted in disbelief. His neatly combed salt and pepper hair and polished Italian loafers screamed wealth and entitlement. He was looking directly at a man sitting in seat 2B, his tone dripping with condescension. "I said, what are you doing here? You sure you're in the right place?" The man in seat 2B looked up from his book. He was calm, his expression unreadable. A tall, athletic black man dressed in dark jeans and a fitted blazer. His presence carried an air of quiet confidence. "Yes, I am in the right place." The businessman scoffed, his voice rising enough to make nearby passengers shift uncomfortably. "I don't think so. First class isn't just open to anyone. You know, you might want to double-check your ticket before making a fool of yourself." A few passengers exchanged nervous glances. Some looked away, pretending not to hear, while others subtly watched, intrigued by the tension brewing. The black man didn't flinch. He closed his book, slowly exhaled, and reached into his pocket. Pulling out his boarding pass, he handed it to the approaching flight attendant who had rushed over at the sound of commotion. "Ma'am, can you please confirm that I am exactly where I should be?" The flight attendant, a young woman with blonde hair tied in a neat bun, glanced at the boarding pass. Then she looked at the businessman with an awkward smile, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Yes, sir, this gentleman is seated correctly in first class." The businessman's eyes flickered with something. Anger, embarrassment, disbelief. "That can't be right. Maybe someone made a mistake. Maybe he—" "No mistake, sir. The passenger in 2B is on our manifest with a first-class ticket." The businessman clenched his jaw, clearly dissatisfied, but there was nothing left to argue. He muttered something under his breath, something about affirmative action and lucky breaks, before turning back toward his seat a few rows ahead. The black man in 2B remained still for a moment, then turned back to his book, as if the entire exchange had been nothing more than a mild inconvenience. But for the other passengers, the air remained heavy, the atmosphere tainted by the awkwardness of an exposed prejudice. 20 minutes later, the businessman ordered a scotch on the rocks. He still couldn't shake the irritation bubbling inside him. He wasn't racist. At least that's what he told himself. He was just confused. After all, first class wasn't exactly filled with people who looked like that. It was usually men like him, executives, CEOs, hedge fund managers, politicians, athletes, on rare occasions, sure, but this man, he didn't fit the mold. "Maybe he won the lottery," he muttered to himself. A voice startled him from his thoughts. Or maybe he earned it. The businessman turned and saw an older woman seated next to him. She was well-dressed, perhaps in her 70s, with sharp eyes that seemed to see through him. "Excuse me. You've been glaring at that man for the past 15 minutes. She stirred her tea, her movements slow, deliberate. "Do you always assume people don't belong when they don't look like you?" The businessman scoffed. "I don't see how this concerns you, ma'am." The woman simply smiled, a denial the most comfortable prison in the world. With that, she turned her attention back to her book, leaving the businessman stewing in his own thoughts. Meanwhile, the man in 2B glanced out the window, watching as the clouds stretched endlessly below. His hands rested loosely in his lap, but his mind was elsewhere. This wasn't the first time he had been questioned about where he belonged. It wouldn't be the last. but he had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. He took a deep breath, leaned back in his seat, and closed his eyes. He had bigger things to worry about, like safely landing this plane. The plane glided smoothly through the clouds, the soft hum of the engines blending with the murmured conversations in the first-class cabin. Flight attendants moved gracefully between seats, refilling drinks and ensuring every passenger was comfortable. For most, it was just another routine flight. But then, without warning, the aircraft shuddered. It wasn't the usual bump of turbulence. It was a deep, unsettling shake that sent a ripple of tension through the cabin. Passengers looked up from their books, screens, and drinks, their eyes darting toward the windows as if searching for an explanation. A second jolt came, this time stronger. Overhead compartments rattled, and a few drinks spilled over tray tables. The murmur of conversation shifted into nervous whispers. Then, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We will keep you updated." For a moment, the passengers relaxed. Turbulence was normal. Pilots handled it all the time. But then the plane dropped. Not a gentle dip, not a slight loss of altitude, but a sharp, stomach-churning plunge that sent trays flying and hands clutching armrests. A woman screamed. Someone's drink hit the ceiling before crashing back down. The flight attendants, who had been calmly moving through the cabin minutes ago, now gripped the nearest seats for support. A child cried out from economy. In first class, the businessman from earlier turned pale, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the armrest. He looked around, his confidence evaporating. This was not normal turbulence. Another jolt, a violent shake. Then, oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Panic erupted. The businessman gasped, his heart pounding. He fumbled with the mask, his hands shaking so badly he could barely secure it over his face. Around him, passengers fought to do the same. Someone was praying. Someone else was sobbing. The plane was still dropping. The intercom crackled again, but this time the voice was strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are experiencing an engine failure. We are working to resolve the issue. Please remain calm. Remain calm." The businessman turned to the nearest flight attendant, his voice frantic. "What the hell is happening? Are we going to crash?" The flight attendant, pale but composed, tried to offer reassurance. "Sir, please stay seated. The pilots are trained for emergencies like this." Trained. His mind raced. Who was flying this plane? Was the pilot competent? Could they survive this? And then, a deep, steady voice cut through the chaos. "Everybody listen up." Heads turned. It was the black man from first class. The same man the businessman had accused of not belonging just an hour ago. But there was no uncertainty in his tone now. No hesitation. Only authority. "I need everyone to stay calm and follow instructions." The businessman blinked, confused. Why was this man giving orders? Then, the man stepped into the aisle, moving with precision and confidence. He didn't just look in control. He was in control. A flight attendant rushed toward him, but instead of stopping him, she listened. He turned toward her, speaking quickly. "Where's Captain Reynolds?" The flight attendant swallowed hard. He collapsed. "We think it was a heart attack. The first officer was trying to stabilize the plane, but he's unconscious now." "Yes." The businessman watched the exchange, his mind spinning. Why did this man know so much? Why was he speaking like someone in charge? Then, the man turned toward the intercom, pressed the button, and his voice echoed through the cabin. "This is First Officer Jordan Blake. Captain Reynolds is incapacitated. I am assuming control. The cabin fell into stunned silence. First officer. Blake was a pilot. A damn pilot. The businessman's mouth went dry. He felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. Jordan ignored the shocked faces around him. There was no time for explanations. He moved swiftly toward the cockpit, stepping over an unconscious flight attendant who had been thrown to the floor in the turbulence. He glanced at her quickly, saw that she was breathing, and pressed forward. When he reached the cockpit, his stomach tightened. The captain was slumped over, his face ashen. The first officer was barely conscious. The instrument panel was blaring warnings in red and yellow. Altitude dropping. Engine 2 offline. Systems failing. He slid into the captain's seat, hands moving instinctively over the controls. Years of training took over. Flight 217, this is First Officer Jordan Blake. Captain Reynolds is unconscious. First Officer Martinez is unresponsive. I am taking command. The air traffic controller on the other end of the radio hesitated. Roger that, Jordan, can you maintain control? I'll do my best, but we're losing altitude fast. Understood. You have priority landing clearance at the nearest runway. Jordan exhaled sharply, gripping the yoke. The plane was still shaking violently. He scanned the instruments, assessing the damage. One engine was gone. The other was struggling. He had to act fast. He flipped switches, adjusted throttle, and fought against the downward pull of gravity. Behind him, the cabin was in chaos. But Jordan's voice remained steady. Flight attendants, prepare for emergency landing. Passengers, brace for impact. He didn't have time to turn around, but he could imagine their faces. Fear, uncertainty, and in the businessman's case, regret. The businessman sat frozen in his seat, sweat dripping down his temple. He had assumed Jordan didn't belong here, and now he was their only hope. The cockpit was a battlefield of alarms, flashing lights, and the relentless pull of gravity. The weight of 100 lives bore down on Jordan Blake's shoulders, but he couldn't afford to think about that. His hands moved across the controls with precision, flipping switches, adjusting the throttle, rerouting power to the failing systems. The aircraft was still losing altitude. The left engine was dead, the right engine struggling. The flight control panel screamed warnings at him, but he had no time to panic. Jordan pressed the intercom button. This is First Officer Blake. We are making an emergency landing. Flight attendants, follow emergency procedures. Passengers, brace for impact. In the cabin, chaos raged. Some people sobbed, clutching hands with their loved ones. Others sat frozen in shock. The businessman, who had spent the first half of the flight believing Jordan didn't belong in first class, was now gripping his armrests so hard his knuckles turned white. His breathing was uneven, his heart hammering in his chest. He had been wrong, terribly, painfully wrong. The man he had belittled, the man he had dismissed, was now the only reason he had a chance of survival. The cabin lights flickered as the plane continued its descent. Jordan's grip on the controls tightened. The nearest runway was still too far. He needed an alternative. He scanned the terrain below. Fields, roads, forests. No clear landing strip. Then he saw it. A river. It was wide, calm, stretching out like a silver ribbon between the dense greenery. It was their best shot. Jordan's voice was calm as he spoke into the radio. Control, we're attempting a water landing. A pause. Then, static-filled response. Copy that, Jordan. Godspeed. Jordan took a deep breath. He knew the risks, Water landings were rare, unpredictable. If he came in too fast, the plane could break apart. If he miscalculated the angle, it could flip. But he had no other choice. He adjusted the flaps, reducing speed as much as possible. The ground rushed toward them, the river growing larger, clearer, closer. In the cabin, people braced. Some prayed. Some whispered desperate apologies to people who weren't there. The businessman sat rigid, his mind blank with fear. He had spent a lifetime believing he was in control. Now, he was entirely at the mercy of the man he had underestimated. The plane shuddered as it neared the surface of the water. The sound of wind howled against the fuselage. Then, impact. The plane slammed into the river, sending a massive wave outward. The force of it threw passengers forward. The businessman felt his seatbelt dig into his chest. Luggage flew through the air. A window cracked. For a moment, everything was noise and chaos and terror. Then silence. The plane had stopped moving. Jordan exhaled, his hands still gripping the controls. They were floating. They had made it. He unbuckled himself and turned. Time to get everyone out. Back in the cabin, people were beginning to stir, dazed but alive. Jordan pushed through the aisle, his voice firm and steady. Everyone remain calm. Flight attendants, open the emergency exits. Move quickly but carefully. The water was rising fast. They had minutes before the plane would sink. The businessman was still frozen in his seat. He watched as passengers hurried toward the exits, stepping onto the inflatable rafts. He saw Jordan moving through the chaos, helping an elderly woman unbuckle her seatbelt, carrying a child who had been too scared to move. Jordan turned to him. "Can you walk?" The businessman tried to respond, but his throat was dry. His legs felt numb. Jordan didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed his arm and pulled him up. "Let's go." The businessman stumbled forward, following Jordan toward the exit. He stepped onto the raft, his hands shaking. The cool night air hit his face, the river stretching out in all directions. Rescue boats were already approaching. He turned back toward the plane, watching as Jordan made sure every last passenger was out before stepping onto the last raft. As the raft drifted away from the sinking aircraft, the businessman swallowed hard. He had never been more wrong about anyone in his life. Hours later, when they were safe on land, when the adrenaline had faded and reality had set in, the businessman stood in front of Jordan. "I was wrong about you." Jordan looked at him, exhaustion in his eyes. "You weren't wrong about me, you were wrong about your assumptions." The businessman nodded slowly. Then, without another word, he walked away, carrying not just the weight of survival, but the heavy burden of a lesson he would never forget. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to support more powerful storytelling like this. And don't stop there. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next video. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below to let us know how this story impacted you or what you'd like to see next. Your feedback helps us create meaningful content that connects with you. Thank you for being a part of our community. Your voice matters.